The Ruy Lopez arises after white plays pawn to a4, black responds with pawn to a5, white develops knight to f3, black replies with knight to c6, and then white plays bishop to b5. We will stay away from the complicated main lines since they involve a lot of deep theory. When you play bishop to b5 as white, your opponent, especially if unsure of theory, often feels that you are threatening the pawn on a5, since you are ready to capture the knight on c6 and then remove the defender of that pawn. To deal with this, many players either protect the pawn on e5 by playing pawn to d6, or they try to chase away your bishop with pawn to a6. Very often, they do both. For example, they may start with pawn to a6, and after you retreat your bishop, they continue with pawn to d6. What should you do then? The simple and strong response is to castle kingside. This move is useful anyway, and it is also a little bit provocative. Your opponent still notices the uncomfortable pin on the e5 pawn, and quite often they will try to push your bishop back with pawn to b5. You simply retreat with bishop to b3. Now, in practice, the overwhelming majority of opponents will continue with bishop to g4. For some reason, many amateur players believe that placing this pin on your knight is very strong and will almost guarantee black good attacking chances. But we will see that white has something prepared. At this point, I always recommend playing pawn to h3. This forces the bishop to make a decision, either to capture your knight or retreat. In most cases, the bishop will retreat, but if black captures, it is not a problem. You recapture with queen to f3, immediately threatening checkmate in 1. Your queen is active, and generally speaking, the bishop is slightly more valuable than the knight anyway. From here, you can continue with pawn to c3, making sure the black knight can never jump into that square. Altogether, white has achieved a comfortable and strong position, but in most cases, instead of capturing, black will drop the bishop back to maintain the pin. At this point, when your opponent feels completely safe, you shock them with the surprising move knight takes c5. This is a real stunner, different from the standard legal's checkmate trap, but just as deadly. So what is happening here? You are sacrificing your queen, and the position suddenly explodes. Black is forced to capture your queen. Otherwise, you would simply take their bishop. After black captures your queen, you continue with bishop takes f7 check. The black king has only one square available, so it steps to e7. Now you strike with knight takes c6, a devastating royal fork. The black king must move, and then you capture the queen on d8 with check. Black is forced to recapture, and after all the trades are finished, you enter an endgame with 2 extra pawns. That advantage is technically winning. However, if black avoids bishop to g4, which as we now see is a mistake, they can instead play the more solid knight to f6, which is a perfectly fine move for black. Still, there are some common attacking patterns and traps that appear in this position. White has 2 main approaches. You can play in a more solid style by playing pawn to c3, which is a typical move in the Ruy Lopez. The idea is to prepare pawn to d4 on the next move, establishing a strong presence in the center of the board and gaining a useful space advantage. However, some opponents will immediately notice that your pawn on e4 appears undefended and will try to capture it. They usually expect that you will respond with rook to e1, after which they plan to retreat their knight safely. But instead of following this standard path, you can surprise them with the powerful move bishop to d5. Suddenly you are attacking multiple pieces along the diagonals and your opponent is in serious trouble. In this position, you are going to win material one way or another. Besides the classical Ruy Lopez plan with pawn to c3 followed by pawn to d4, there is also another aggressive option. You can transition into the fried liver attack with knight to g5. This will catch many opponents off guard, because they expect this attack only in the Italian game or the 2 knights defense, not in the Ruy Lopez. But since your bishop has already repositioned to the diagonal leading toward the black king, the setup becomes very similar, and the fried liver attack is suddenly on the board. Here you target the weak pawn near the black king. Defending it is not so simple. The typical response from black is pawn to d5, challenging your center. You capture, and strangely enough, recapturing with the knight is already a losing mistake for black. Most opponents do not realize this and will fall directly into the trap. Now you execute the classic fried liver combination. Knight takes f7, temporarily sacrificing your knight. After the forced capture, you follow with queen to f3, applying massive pressure against the black king and the pinned knight. If the king tries to retreat, you continue with bishop takes d5, hitting both the knight and the rook along the diagonal. If black attempts knight to d4 as a counterattack, you do not back down. Instead, you push forward with your attack. At this point, the game is very close to a scholar's mate-style checkmating pattern, and black's position collapses quickly. What else can your opponent try? Let's start with the more common amateur-level moves before moving on to the stronger, theory-based responses that more experienced players know. At the club level, once your opponent notices the pressure you are putting on the center, especially on the pawn at e5, they may try to defend it directly with pawn to d6. At first glance, this looks simple and solid, but in reality, it weakens black's king and places their knight in a vulnerable pin. White can immediately take advantage by striking in the center with pawn to d4. Now you are threatening either to capture in the center or to push forward, while your bishop continues to apply strong pressure. Black will usually capture, and you recapture with your knight, instantly attacking the pinned knight twice. To avoid losing material, black defends it, but you calmly continue developing your pieces. At this point, many opponents, uncomfortable with the pressure you are applying, will try to trade pieces to simplify the position. They may exchange knights, and even trade bishops. On the surface, this seems like it has solved all of black's problems and left them completely secure. But soon after, the most common move you will see from black is knight to f6. Seemingly natural, yet it still allows white to keep the initiative. Strangely enough, that move actually turns out to be a losing error, because white can immediately strike back with the powerful central breakthrough pawn to a5. This move is crushing. You are attacking multiple points at once. Your pawn and knight both apply pressure, and your queen is perfectly placed to join the attack. If black captures in the center, then after queen takes a5, you create a double attack, targeting the black king and the vulnerable pawn on c7. No matter how black tries to cover their king, you continue with knight takes c7 check, forcing a trade of queens. On the very next move, you will capture the rook in the corner, securing a decisive material advantage. Some opponents, however, will try to avoid this line by going for the so-called bird's defense, where they play knight to d4. This way, they counterattack your bishop and remove the immediate pressure against their knight on c6. What should you do then? The answer is simple. Exchange knight, and then calmly castle. Since you have already developed all your kingside pieces, castling comes naturally here, placing your king safely out of danger and leaving you ready to continue the attack. Now black begins to face problems with development. If they try to bring out a knight, white can always kick it back with pawn to a5, which is uncomfortable for black. Normally, black would like to develop the light-squared bishop by pushing a pawn, but that pawn is pinned to the king, so they cannot safely play pawn to d6 right away. They might instead develop the dark-squared bishop, but more often black prefers to challenge your bishop first with pawn to a6. In response, you simply retreat your bishop to c4. This is one of the subtle tricks of the Ruy Lopez. By relocating your bishop to this diagonal, you recreate the typical Italian game setup, which opens the door to many sharp attacking ideas. For example, if black plays bishop to c5, a move that looks standard and solid, it actually fails to a tactical shot. You can sacrifice with bishop takes f7, and after the king captures, you immediately follow with queen to h5, delivering a double attack. You regain your piece with interest, and the black king is left fully exposed, giving you a winning position. Many opponents will also be tempted by pawn to b5, thinking they can chase your bishop and perhaps follow with pawn to c5. They expect you to retreat passively to b3. Instead, you launch another sacrifice on f7. After the king captures, you again play queen to h5. At first glance, black may not understand the danger, but they are already lost. If they try pawn to g6, you respond with queen to d5, unleashing the full point of your plan. You attack both the king and the rook in the corner. You win decisive material while the black king remains exposed, ensuring a clear winning advantage. Thanks for watching.